Megan stood on her doorstep with an envelope from the HOA. Inside, an ultimatum. Her guest house was to be demolished. But that was just the beginning. Everything she believed was fair was crumbling. And when the chairman said, "Rules are rules," things took a turn no one expected. What happened next shocked everyone. But let's start from the beginning. Megan Harris, a 35-year-old woman, had always considered her home a sanctuary, a place where hard work and dreams could take root. She'd spent the last year building a guest house in her suburban California backyard, investing every penny she had into it. It wasn't just a project. It was her vision realized, a space for family to visit and for herself to feel accomplished. She'd followed every guideline set by the Homeowners Association, HOA, paid all the required fees, and even had the plans approved months before construction began. Then, one morning, she received a letter from the HOA. The letter was blunt. Her guest house was a violation of HOA regulations, and it had to be demolished immediately. Her heart sank. There was no way this was right. She had triple-checked everything. The rules hadn't changed. She had done everything by the book. Yet here she was, being told to tear down the one thing that had taken so much out of her, both emotionally and financially. Confused and now enraged, Megan set up a meeting with the HOA board, certain that this was a misunderstanding that could be cleared up. But when she arrived, she was met with nothing but indifference. The board chairperson, Brian Mitchell, sat at the head of the table, his posture rigid, his gaze dismissive. Megan tried to reason with him, to explain that she'd followed all the rules, that the guest house fit perfectly within the established guidelines. But Mitchell wasn't interested in hearing her. "Rules are rules, Megan," he said, his voice cold and final. "I'm afraid there's nothing more to discuss." Her stomach twisted. There was no compassion in his words, no room for negotiation. To him, this was just another case, another set of rules to enforce. But to Megan, it was everything. The destruction of a dream, the betrayal of trust. Her hard work, her years of savings, all of it was suddenly nothing more than a violation to be erased. In that moment, she realized something crucial. This wasn't just about a building. It was about power, how the HOA used it to crush those who dared to step outside their narrow boundaries. And Megan wasn't about to let that stand. Megan wasn't going to let this stand. The HOA's demand was unjust, and she couldn't accept it. She sought legal advice, hoping that a professional could help her navigate the maze of rules and regulations. She hired Tom Wilson, a lawyer with years of experience in HOA disputes. But even with his expertise, the road ahead seemed endless. Every time Megan thought she'd made progress, the HOA threw up another roadblock. Brian Mitchell, the chairperson, became increasingly hostile, his arrogance palpable. He seemed to take personal pleasure in seeing her struggle, in forcing her to jump through hoops she shouldn't have had to. Megan reached out to her neighbors, hoping for solidarity. She'd always been a good neighbor, someone who contributed to the community. Surely someone would back her up. But the more she tried to rally support, the more isolated she felt. Most of her neighbors seemed content to stay out of it, some even siding with the HOA, either out of fear or indifference. The few who showed concern didn't have the courage to stand up. Megan began to feel like an outsider in her own community, a feeling she wasn't used to. The silence from those she had once called friends only deepened her resolve. The frustration built with each passing day. Why was this happening? Why was Brian Mitchell so hell-bent on destroying everything she had worked for? Megan had always been an upstanding member of the community, polite, respectful, and always willing to lend a hand. She had followed the rules, paid her dues, and had nothing but good intentions. And yet, here she was, being treated like a criminal. The more she tried to stand her ground, the more Brian seemed to enjoy her discomfort, dismissing her concerns with a smug, disinterested look every time they crossed paths. Each visit to the HOA office felt like a battle she couldn't win. The paperwork piled up, the emails ignored, the phone calls unreturned. Megan felt like she was drowning in red tape, fighting an enemy who had all the power, and she was just one person. But she refused to back down. She couldn't let this injustice define her. It wasn't just the guest house at stake anymore. It was her sense of fairness, her belief in doing what was right. This wasn't just about a structure of wood and nails. It was about standing up for herself and showing that the HOA's overreach wouldn't break her. With Tom's help, she began preparing for the legal battle of a lifetime. It would test everything she had, her strength, her resilience, and her faith in the system. But Megan wasn't about to let them win. Not this time. As Megan and Tom entered the courtroom, the tension was palpable. From the start, it was clear that this wasn't just a legal dispute. It had become personal. Brian Mitchell, the HOA chairperson, wasn't just focused on enforcing rules. His words dripped with venom every time he addressed Megan. With every sly remark, he tried to paint her as a troublemaker, accusing her of deliberately flouting the HOA's regulations. He questioned her character, her integrity, and tried to undermine everything she stood for. It was obvious to Megan that Brian's motives went far beyond enforcing compliance. He had a personal vendetta, and she was his target. But Megan refused to let his insults rattle her. She knew the stakes were high, and every court session, every legal maneuver, felt like a new battle in a war that had already dragged on for too long. The case had attracted attention, and soon the once tight-knit community had fractured. Some neighbors rallied behind Megan, seeing her fight as a stand against the arbitrary power of the HOA. Others, swayed by Brian's influence, viewed her as a troublemaker, someone who was disrupting the peace of their idyllic suburban life. The more the case progressed, the more divided the neighborhood became. It wasn't just about a guest house anymore. It was about loyalty, reputation, and the fear of stepping out of line. Megan felt like an outcast in the very place she had once felt at home. But that didn't matter now. What mattered was the fight for justice. This wasn't about a structure or a house. It was about the principle that the rules should be applied fairly to everyone, not used as a tool for someone's personal gain. And just when it seemed like Brian and the HOA were on the verge of victory, a breakthrough came. Tom, Megan's lawyer, discovered a critical flaw in the HOA's paperwork, a glaring discrepancy in how the rules had been applied to her property versus other homes in the neighborhood. The HOA, it turned out, had been selectively enforcing its own regulations, showing favoritism towards some homeowners while unfairly targeting Megan. It was a crucial twist in the case, one that could turn the tide in her favor. With the new evidence, Tom launched a counterattack, arguing that the HOA's actions weren't just wrong, they were unlawful. Megan wasn't just fighting for her property anymore. She was fighting for the fairness she had been denied, for the right to be treated as an equal in a community that had turned its back on her. The court's decision came down like a bombshell. The judge ruled in Megan's favor, declaring that the HOA had violated its own guidelines and had acted with gross negligence. The guest house would not only be spared, but the HOA was ordered to pay damages to Megan for the distress they had caused her. Brian Mitchell was publicly reprimanded for his actions, and his leadership of the HOA was revoked. The community, which had been fractured by the controversy, slowly began to heal. Megan, now vindicated, stood in front of her guest house, watching the sun set, feeling a deep sense of relief and accomplishment. The emotional journey from the shock of injustice to the final satisfaction was profound. Megan's hard-fought battle had proven that standing up for what was right could, in the end, lead to victory. Her sense of justice, her desire for fairness, had triumphed over the HOA's oppressive power. The relief she felt wasn't just about winning. It was about reclaiming her dignity and proving that, no matter how stacked the odds, justice could still be served.